So lesson number 4, our final lesson, heroes and hostages. We're going to take tonight's class full circle, unfortunately, and we're going to be discussing hostages throughout Jewish history. We're going to speak about 3 scenarios of hostages, and then we'll bring it back to briefly. We're not going to exhaust the subject. It's a subject. We won't exhaust it tonight. We actually did exhausted the subject somewhat last Shavuos. At about 2 a.m., we had a conversation about what the Torah says about negotiating for hostages, which is a very complicated subject, and it becomes more complicated because it's very emotional, which it should be, unfortunately. So we're going to come back to that at the end of the class, but if you pay close attention, you'll glean some hints into, and more than hints, actual instructions and guidance into some of the considerations as to negotiating for hostages. And we're going to see that today's modern day scenarios have new variables that didn't exist in the past. This book was produced in the last couple of months. Yeah, so it was actually printed probably in the last couple of months. Yeah. I have to post October 7th. Yeah, so they're considering all of that. Yeah. Okay. So let's first begin with the very big mitzvah. There is a very big mitzvah called Pidyon Shavuyim, which means redeeming captives. That means that when we know that there is a Jew who is a captive of some sort, whether it's they're sitting in prison or they're a hostage or they're being held by someone somewhere, generally speaking, we're talking about in an unjust situation, which historically was typically the case. We're not talking about a criminal, right? But we're talking about someone who is being held against by force, against their will. We have a mitzvah of pidyon shavuyim, and wrongfully also imprisoned, which was very common as well, to just find a pretense and on some small whim to imprison a Jew. There were actually some of our great Hasidic masters who lived about 200 in the Hasidic world as it evolved beginning 350 years ago, and some of them spent their entire lives redeeming Jews who were taken into captivity, which part of it we'll discuss tonight. We're not going to, we'll be discussing earlier times in history than the Hasidic movement of which started in the 1700s. But during that time also, there were innkeepers who were always thrown into prison because they didn't pay their rent or something like that. And they would go around and always raising money to redeem people in prison. It's a very, very big mitzvah. And you can read that, we will read that in text number 1. We see the power of this mitzvah, the importance of this mitzvah. So, Matt, if you can start with text number 1, that's on page 145.
The redemption of captives takes priority over sustaining the poor and providing them. There is no greater mitzvah than redeeming captives. If we ignore the redemption of captives, we transgress the following prohibitions. You shall not harden your heart to the needy. You shall not shut your hand to the needy. You shall not stand by when your fellow's life is in danger. You may not allow a worker to be oppressed ruthlessly. In neglecting to redeem captives, we also negate the following proactive mitzvot. You shall surely open your hand to your needy fellow. Your brother shall live with you financially. Love your neighbor as yourself. Rescue those for death, and many similar statements. If we delay redeeming captives when it is possible to hasten, it is as if we're spilling blood in every added moment.
Okay, excellent. So what's interesting here is, I'm just having trouble with my clicker here, but we have a whole bunch of dimensions that go into this mitzvah. One is charity. It's an element of charity. You shall not harden your heart. So the Torah commands us that when a fellow Jew needs help, in the context the Torah is writing about it's typically financial help. Well, you shouldn't harden your heart. You shall not shut your hand. Okay. And then we have you shall surely open your hand to your needy fellow. So there's what we call a negative commandment and a positive commandment. Negative commandment, you shall not shut your hand, and your brother shall live with you, which means that your brother shall live with you, which means that alongside you, your brother should live, which means we have to take care of our fellow Jew. It's saving lives. You shall not stand by when your fellow's life is in danger. We have a biblical commandment. By the way, this is a big value that doesn't necessarily exist in the secular world. If someone else is losing their life, is it my responsibility to help them? Well, it would be very magnanimous, but do I have to? Well, from the Torah teaches us, yes, we are obligated to help someone who's losing their life. Preventing slavery, you may not allow a worker to be oppressed ruthlessly. And love for your fellow Jew, love your neighbor as yourself. So we see that as the code of Jewish law teaches us, that the mitzvah of redeeming a captive actually is fulfilling numerous commandments in the Torah at one time. And so if you sum it all up, if my clicker will behave, gosh, I don't know what's going on tonight. I'll go backward. Oh, I missed it. No, there we go. So we have charity, saving lives, preventing slavery, love for your fellow. That is all in redeeming captives. Okay. Now, many Jewish communities, tragically, throughout history, had to navigate very complex negotiations because it was very common. Jews were, we are the scapegoat. We have been, I should say. God willing, we no longer will be. But we have been the scapegoat in many instances. And therefore, Jews were abused in this way very often, typically for monetary purposes, when it was hostage taking. Right? If it wasn't hostage taking, it was murder, unfortunately. But when it was hostage taking, it was typically for money. And that's what we're going to see differentiates a little bit what's going on today and what went on then. We'll get to that at the end of the class. Okay, so let's begin. Just a moment. Yeah. So let's begin with the first of our three historic scenarios of hostages. We're going to have three different types of scenarios that took place. The first one is called the four captives. Okay, and this event, the four captives, actually was history changing. It had actually a significant impact in history in a very ironic way. Something shifted history, and in a certain way, it brought some positivity to the development of the Jewish people in diaspora. But it definitely shifted the trajectory of things in diaspora. And in order to understand the context historically, we need to go back in history. So we're going to just get a very general sense of history. Some of you may be familiar with this. So the second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 68 CE. If you want to round that off, you can say 70 CE, Common Era. And what ended up happening was the Jewish people were led at that time by a group of rabbis, by many of the rabbis who were living then. There was the leading scholars, I should say. When I say rabbis, I mean leading scholars. Okay, the leading scholars of that time, and they are called until today Tanoim. Tanoim, that's what they're called. It's an Aramaic word. Tana is an Aramaic word, and that's what they're called. And they are the ones who completed the collection of works of the oral Torah called the Mishnah, which is the first compilation of oral writings, where the oral Torah was written down. That was led by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, but it quotes many, many rabbis, and all of those rabbis during that time were the Tanoim. And so they were the authorities, the Torah and halacha, primarily halachic authorities, Jewish law authorities of the Jewish people at that time. Then, about 300 years later, or 200 years later, actually, started the Talmudic period. So you had the Mishnah, and some of you know this from our Talmud course. So we had the Mishnah, then we have the Talmud. So from the year 300 to 500, Common Era, we have rabbis debating the Mishnah, and they end up writing down the Talmud, which is far more um, far more thorough, we'll say, or advanced than the Mishnah. And all of these rabbis are called Amoraim. It's a later period. The Amoraim have great respect for the Tanaim. They give precedent to the Tanaim. And then they have their own debates. If anything was not conclusive by the Tanaim, they have their own debates and are determining Jewish law. Okay? Anyone knows who comes after the Amoraim? Anyone remember? Amoraim, then, not the Rishonim yet, Gaonim. You have the Gaonim, right? So you have the Gaonim. The Gaonim, where the rabbis were living, 500 Common Era to about 1,000 Common Era. Okay? And our first story of the four captives is going to be at the end of, like, just before 1,000 Common Era, about 900 and something Common Era, which is going to shift things. But what's going to shift is that during these 500 years, despite the fact that the Jewish people are being sent are going into different, broader and broader exile. So they end up in Africa, right, in Europe, in all these different places. When they have a question about Jewish law, what do? They write to the Gaonim in Babylonia, they get their ruling, and that's the ruling. So there's still a somewhat central body of authority in Jewish law, which is the Gaonim. What happens in what we're going to read now is that there becomes a shift. This started getting difficult. So what happens is everyone is writing to the Gaonim who are in Babylonia, and they're getting responses. This event is really what is going to shift and change this, where the authorities, local authorities, will begin to take responsibility for halachic decisions and no longer are depending on the Gaonim, which is not such a simple matter because they're not local. And what we're going to be discussing was recorded by a rabbi by the name of the Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben Duad, which he recorded 150 years after the event happened. And his grandfather was a student of the son of one of these rabbis. We're going to see in a second. Okay, so that's how we get this event. And we're going to start with. So if you look, by the way, on page 148, you see a picture on 148. That is a manuscript copy of a responsum, which is a response to a question sent by Rabbi Sherira and Rabbi Haigoin. They were all called Gaon because they were Gaonim. And they sent these to Egypt, right? Demonstrating that there was this correspondence that was constantly going on. But by the year 1000, around that time, things began to shift. And let's begin with understanding this story, the background of the story, with the reading of text number 2.
It was brought about by God that He that the income of the yeshiva, which used to come from Spain, the land of the Maghreb, Ifriqiya, Egypt, and the Holy Land was discontinued. Following were circumstances that brought this about. Ibn Rumayas, the commander of a fleet, left Cordoba, having been sent by the Muslim king of Spain, and Rahman Nasir, the commander of the mighty fleet, set out to capture the ships of the Christians and the towns that were close to the coast. They sailed as far as the land of Israel, swung about to the Greek Sea and the islands therein. Here they encountered a ship carrying 4 great scholars who were traveling from the city of Barbie to a city called Sebastian, and who were on their way to a convention. Ibn Rumayas captured the ship and took the sage prisoner. One of them was Rabbi Chushidel, father of Rabbi Dean
Hananel.
Another rabbi was Moshe, the father of Rabbi Tanakh, who was taken prisoner with his wife and son. Rabbi Tanakh, who was then but a young lad. The third was Rabbi Shemaraya, then Rabbi Ottoman. As for the fourth does not know his name. These sages did not tell Stoll about themselves, whether it was the commander, sold Rabbi Shemira in Alexandria of Egypt, and proceeded to Bostad, where he became the head of the yeshiva. He then sold Rabbi Shizizel,
Chushiel.
on the coast of Ifrakaya.
That's Tunisia, by the way. That's modern day Tunisia.
Tunisia, okay.
Yeah.
From there, the rabbi proceeded to the city of Karion, which was then mighty small Muslim cities in the land of the Maghreb, where he became the head of the yeshiva, and where he got his son, Rabbi Chanel. The commander then arrived at Cordoba, where he sold Rabbi Moshe along with Rabbi Chanel. This affair occurred in the days of Rabbi Shiri Gaon in about 4750 or 990 CD, somewhat more or less.
Okay. It was a dense paragraph. So let me paraphrase exactly what's going on. It's a little bit confusing. There were four rabbis who were Italian rabbis, and they got onto a ship, which is the means of travel those days, and they were traveling to go to it seems like, we're not 100% clear from the language of the way the story is written, it's called a kala. So a kala could either mean a bride, but in those days, Yarche Kala was a big Torah event, basically like a Torah convention or conference. And that would make most sense of why these four rabbis were traveling together. And they're coming to, they're coming from a Christian land, right? Italy. Italy has very little ties with Babylonia because Babylonia is Muslim, and the two didn't get along. And in Italy, they were already deciding their own halachic decisions. But as we discussed but as we see over here, North Africa, Spain, and Central Europe are still dependent on the Gaonim in Babylonia. This story is going to change them and make them independent. And we're going to see very clearly how that happens. What happens is they're on a ship traveling, and this ship is taken over by pirates, by these, this group that from the command Ibn Rumahis, who was sent by the Muslim king of Spain. So they take over the ship, and now they have hostages, and hostages are fantastic. You can sell them as slaves and make money. So they take them. The rabbis wisely do not shear who they are. They're just Jews. So they don't let on that they're big scholars. Why not? Due to ransom. If they're big scholars, the ransom is going to be much higher. So they deliberately don't say anything, so there shouldn't be a big burden. And then what happens? They're brought to, each one of them was redeemed in a different country. Who redeemed them? Who redeemed them? Who do you think? The Jewish community, right? This is one of the great beauties of the Jewish people. That, you're caught. Imagine if someone is not a Jew. They're, whatever they are, right? They're caught, then they come to a foreign country. Who's going to redeem him? Right? Unless they find use for him. Right? But the Jews, useful, not useful. He's a Jew, we're going to redeem him. So immediately everyone, the communities redeem him. But the people who redeemed them were communities who didn't know who they were, and in many cases were very different than them. Because a lot of these communities were Sephardic, right? They were Italian. Italians actually, Italian Jewry, there isn't such a strong presence anymore, but they have a unique tradition. They have their own siddur. They have certain uniquenesses. So the Ravid, who's writing this story 150 years after it happened, so it's probably 1150 or so that he's writing this story. His grandfather was a student of Rabbi Chanoch, and as you see in the story, Rabbi Chanoch was the son of Rabbi Moshe, one of the hostages, and Rabbi Chanoch himself was taken prisoner with his father. So the Ravid's grandfather learned under the son of one of the hostages, who himself, the son, also was such a hostage. So at least we know the background of the story. And okay, so that's what happened. Let's read now text number 3. Again, this is from the Ravid, who himself has a direct association with the story in that his grandfather studied by under Rabbi Chanoch, who is the son of Rabbi Moshe. Rabbi Chanoch and Rabbi Moshe were redeemed in Spain. So 2 Jews come off the boat. The Spanish Jewish community sees that there are 2 Jews who are hostages, or probably, because by the way, the pirates themselves were from Cordova. They probably come to the Jewish community and say, "We have some Jews. Would you like to redeem them?" So the Jewish community redeems them, and then something amazing happens. They don't know who they are. 2 Italian Jews. Okay, right? Then what happens? A fascinating story. Let's read text number 3.
Rabbi Moshe was redeemed by the people of Cordova, who were under the impression that he was a man of no education. Now in Cordova there was a synagogue that was called Knesset HaMikdash, the study gathered hall, where a judge by the name of Rabbi Natan the Pious, who was a man of distinction, resided. Rabbi Moshe was seated in the corner like intended, and he rose before Rabbi Natan and challenged an interpretation Rabbi Natan had given. When Rabbi Natan and the students heard Rabbi Moshe's words, they marveled to each other and asked him to explain the law to them. This he did quite properly. Then each of them posed to him all the difficulties that they had, and he replied to them with abundant wisdom. Outside the study hall, there were litigants who were not permitted to enter until the students had completed their lesson. On that day, Rabbi Natan, the judge, walked out, and the litigants followed him. However, he said to them, "I'll no longer judge. This man, who is dressed in rags and is a stranger, is my master, and I shall be his disciple from this day on. You ought to appoint him judge of the community of Cordova," and that's exactly what he did. The community then assigned Rabbi Moshe a large stipend and honored him with expensive gardens and a carriage. At that point, the commander wished to retract his sale. However, the king would not permit him to do so, for he was delighted by the fact that the Jews in his domain no longer knew the people of Babylonia. The report of all this spread throughout the land of Spain and the Netherlands, and the students came to study under Rabbi Moshe. Moreover, all questions which had formerly been addressed to the academies of Babylonia were now directed to him. The communities of West and East did not resume sending gifts to the academies in Babylonia, because these scholars made many disciples, and the knowledge of the Talmud spread throughout the world.
Beautiful. This is really fascinating. Right? So Rabbi Moshe, who is used to being a halachic authority because he's from Italy, who cannot communicate with Babylonia, shows up and suddenly he's the leading rabbi in the country. Not only that, the Muslim leader is excited because he says now they're not going to be in touch with with Babylonia anymore. Even though actually they're both Muslim countries, it seems like. But whatever it is, right? Just a second. Right. But that they wouldn't need, right. Okay, but still that they wouldn't need, and they would be independent, and therefore he didn't let them negotiate a better price. By the way, I just want to mention, being that we're having trouble, everything is by divine providence. So I just want to tell you, everyone on Zoom, that we just got a quote. This is honestly this week, I think yesterday, for an upgraded AV system, which would have a built-in camera at the back of the room, which would both serve to record, so we don't have to have this contraption, and it'll serve to feed right into Zoom with proper audio and speakers and everything, for only $25,000. So you may want to consider sponsoring it, a whole part, whatever it is, but you can let me know. And I'm actually very serious about it because we do have to find someone to sponsor it, and it would make my life personally a lot easier because I won't have to set all these things up every class. So I'm very serious about that. So if you're anyone interested, let me know. Okay, so Rabbi Chanoch is the son of Rabbi Moshe, and Rabbi Chanoch succeeds him and becomes the teacher of the grandfather of the Ravid. And now a new era of first-rate scholarship opens up in Spain, and they are making their own halachic decisions. And actually, if you remember, Rabbi Shmuel Hanagid, you remember he was the chief of staff in Spain a few hundred years later. No, not a few hundred years, a couple, just shortly later. He was also the student of Rabbi Chanoch. So it was maybe 50 years after Rabbi Moshe. He was a student of Rabbi Chanoch. And all of this led to there being a world-renowned rabbi until today, because he's prominent in the prominent commentary on the Talmud known as the Rif, and another commentary who you do know, whose name is Rambam, Maimonides. All of these are scholars now coming out who are becoming halachic authorities, and this all happened because of the hostage taking, which brought the Italian rabbi, Rabbi Moshe, and his son Rabbi Chanoch to Spain. And this played out in Egypt as well, because one of the rabbis was sold in Egypt, and he became a leading rabbi in Egypt, as we read in the text. And this happened in Tunisia. The rabbi became a leading rabbi in Tunisia. So suddenly these four Italian rabbis begin to create a proliferation of Jewish law throughout the broader Jewish world. Yeah.
In those days, the Jewish communities had spoken Aramaic. We learned how to talk to each other.
Oh, how'd they communicate? That is a good question. I would think that most people were more. I'm not 100% sure. I would think it was Aramaic. I don't think it was Hebrew, because Hebrew already was a second language for many Jews. But I would think it was Aramaic. Yeah.
The difference between Ladino and Aramaic?
Ladino, I think, is big. Ladino is a Spanish style language as opposed to Aramaic, which is not. But it also could be the Italians. What do they speak? Italiano? Is that what it's called? What's their language? Is it similar to Spanish? Okay, so maybe that's how they had similar languages. So maybe the Italians and Africans spoke similar. I don't know. Good question. Interesting question. I don't know the answer. And what this all begins is so there are certain tractates of Talmud which we don't have Rashi's commentary. You may know that the primary commentary on the Talmud is Rashi. So in yeshiva, when you study Talmud, the first commentary you study is Rashi, because Rashi is basically there just to help you understand what the Talmud is saying. Pre-sophistication. What is the Talmud saying? Right? There are certain tractates, just a few, that don't have Rashi's commentary. Whose commentary do we study? Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel wrote a commentary similar to Rashi, but a much more expanded version. Rashi is very concise. He was much lengthier. So if I remember correctly, Tractate Nidarim has half of it has only Rabbeinu Hananel. So I feel like I have a little bit of a relationship with Rabbeinu Hananel because I studied some of his commentary when I studied Talmud. And Rabbeinu Hananel was the son of Rabbi Chushiel, one of the captives, and he writes a commentary on the Talmud. And this began a new era, as someone said before, the Rishonim. I think you left Joel said it. Was the Rishonim. Now starts a new era called the Rishonim, who are now a new era of halachic authority. And we can see from all of this, so the boats carrying four, they're intercepted by pirates, kept their status as accomplished rabbis a secret, sold to Jewish communities across the Mediterranean. Rav Moshe of Cordova revealed his extensive Torah knowledge, immediately appointed the head of the yeshiva. It seems very clear that his knowledge was like way beyond what the leading rabbi then was, right? It seems like they came with like an enormous scholarship. And then the pirates tried to avoid the sale, but the king wouldn't allow it. Students flocked to study under him. So this is like a real transformation. And what we see from all of this is catalyst for the era of the Rishonim. That means this is a catalyst for the beginning of this new era. And it also shows us the divine hand that's guiding history. That while something terrible is happening, Hashem is really actually orchestrating that Jewish law be able to sustain itself in these more, I don't know if we can call them far-flung places, but in places which were detached from the main authority of Jewish law. Let's read text number 4. This is written by a Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who makes this point.
As the sun set on the yeshivot of Surah and Pumbedita in Babylon, The world was desperate, and it seemed that Torah was set to be forgotten. But then, precisely at this critical time, the Torah spread to all corners of the earth, reaching as far as Egypt and Africa, Spain and France. For God left us a remnant, 4 captives. Divine providence arranged that these men be taken captive and sold as slaves in the 4 corners of the world in order to spread Torah into distant land. Anyone who looks with open eyes will see that this jug of oil, the Torah, has not yet emptied, for this miracle continues to repeat itself in our days. Just as the Jewish people are eternal, so is this jug of oil eternal. Moreover, the eternity of the Torah is the root of the eternity of the Jewish people.
Okay, very good. So it's it's just amazing how God orchestrates things through history. Okay, now we're going to go to our second story. We're good, everyone? Ready for our second story? Our second story is probably the most well-known hostage story in Jewish history, and that is a story about Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Rothenburg is in Germany, and he was born in the year 1220 in Worms, Germany. We're going to start this with a video to give us the background of the story, and then we'll review it and discuss exactly what happens and how he guides us in regards to ransoming hostages.
We don't have an exact year of birth for Meir of Rothenburg, which is very common in the medieval period. There were no birth certificates or other certificates. We believe he was born somewhere between 1215 and 1220 something. He was originally from Worms in the Rhineland, and that's where he's buried to this day, because there were not a lot of great scholars left in Germany at that particular time. Meir of Rothenburg went to France. He went to northern France, where he studied with a series of very important Tosafists, those who commented on the Talmud and on Rashi's commentary to the Talmud. That started in the mid-12th century. He got there somewhere, we know when he was there, he got there somewhere around 1230 or 40, again, depending on when he was born. And his most important teacher there was someone named Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. And that's important for a number of reasons, aside from Rabbi Yechiel being a great Torah scholar. Meir of Rothenburg was apparently in Paris when the Talmud was burned in the year 1242. That was the result of the so-called trial of the Talmud in 1240. Not that it was all disaster. There was plenty of good Torah study, and in that respect, Meir of Rothenburg took in this French Tosafist method of study of comparing texts and resolving texts. And Rothenburg was not his original hometown. Rothenburg is in south central Germany. He seems to have gone there once he came back from northern France. Maharam very quickly becomes the Gadol Hador, the leading Torah scholar of his generation. Again, not just because there weren't many others, but he really distinguished himself. Already in the 1240s, the trial of the Talmud, which Maharam witnessed, that's the 1240s. As we move forward, the Jews in northern France are under tremendous economic pressure, meaning money is owed to them, debts are canceled, so their livelihoods are basically threatened to the core. There are physical persecutions, there are attempts at conversion. Again, the rulers, some of them try to provide some security, servi camerai, serfs of the chamber. The king will protect the Jews, but these protections, and France and Germany are a little different here, but these protections don't always hold up. And many of the questions that Maharam received were questions about things that happened during conversionary efforts. So again, on the basis of all the earlier persecutions, Maharam was not, in that sense, jumping ship. It was pikuach nefesh. Maharam believed that his life was in danger. Whether he knew somehow that he might be captured or something else is purely speculative, but in any case, Maharam he leaves Germany. Apparently, Maharam was on the way to Israel. What we know for sure is that he moves eastward. He's in Germany, which is sort of the center of the Holy Roman Empire. As you move southeast, you get to Italy, right? The Alps, however you cross, however you go around. And apparently in 1286, this we have some contemporary documentation, Maharam, he apparently had stopped there to wait for others to come with him to follow, and Maharam was captured by agents of the Holy Roman Emperor, by agents of the King of Germany, who also had control of this area of Italy. Again, there are suggestions that somebody informed on Maharam or informed them that Maharam, again, great scholars had to travel incognito. You can ask the question, is this mainly anti-Semitism? Is this mainly economic? Is this mainly political? And the answer to that question is yes, all of the above. They were looking for the economic benefits, they were looking for the anti-Jewish benefits, they were looking for the political benefits, showing who's in charge. In any case, Maharam at that point is captured, and he is brought back by the Holy Roman Emperor to Germany, where he is put in at least one or two, maybe more, quote-unquote fortresses. These are not prisons in the Rikers Island sense, if I can say that. These are not prisons where you're treated horribly. He's a political prisoner. He's an economic prisoner. In other words, the capture was done so that the Jews would pay large sums of money to try to get Maharam out.
This is just hearing the story, when we talk about anti-Semitism today, I say thank God, relatively speaking, but, back then, it was to survive as a Jew was a miracle. It almost seems. So he's born around 1220. His father, he's born in Worms, Germany, and his father is a dayan. A dayan is a judge, a Jewish judge, which is basically a high-level rabbi who makes high-level halachic decisions. He goes when he's in his 20s to learn under the Tosafot, which is, you may have heard of. They are very prominent on the page of a Talmud for their commentary on the Talmud. So you have Rashi that's on the inside of the page commentary, and Tosafot on the outside of the page. And he goes, and the Tosafot were made up of many scholars, and he goes to learn under some of them, and he witnessed the trial of the Talmud. If you remember, for those who took the Talmud course, we opened up the course with that in 1242, and because Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg saw that, he actually wrote a lamentation about the burning of the Talmud, which we say every year on Tisha B'Av in our book of Kinos, of Lamentations that we say on Tisha B'Av about destruction through our history. And he settles back in Rothenburg. I think some people say he later goes back to his birthplace, Worms. He becomes a leading authority, rabbinic authority in Germany. He deals with very complicated questions. He writes many responsa, and he helps shape a lot of Ashkenazic custom based on the responsa that he gives, the answers that he gives to many of the questions. But many of the questions he's dealing with are horrific questions that people have to deal with when you have family members being killed, taken hostage, all these different types of horrific things that are happening to the Jews. There was a blood libel in 1235. There were pogroms through Germany in 1285 and 1286. I wonder if that actually, the pogroms had an impact. The story is very interesting to me, and I didn't research more of it. But I would think as a rabbi, right, I would think, and I'm not a world-class rabbi, but Rabbi Meir Rothenberg was, but I would think any leader of any community, even if it's a small community, you have a big responsibility when you do something, because people watch you. So it's just interesting to me, and I'm just speaking out loud my thoughts, which is not always a good idea, but that, he decided to leave the country. It seems that he was going to Israel. We have some evidence from some documents that he was trying to go to Israel. But, when you're a leader of a people, where does that leave the people? And again, I'm just asking a question. I'm not questioning him. I'm sure there's some story there that I don't know of, but it just piques my interest. So, and during that time, the Jews in Germany, in Europe, they were serfs. So basically, they had they were the property of the lords or of the kings. They had no rights of their own. So to decide that I'm going to go and leave the country, you had no right to pick yourself up and leave. You needed to get permission, which he didn't do. And he made this effort with his daring escape. And actually, what ends up happening in 1615, which is maybe let's say 400 years later, or 350 years later, is that the Jews end up being expelled from Worms. There's a synagogue that's burned down. The next year, when Jews come back to the synagogue, they find a document. And that document tells us some of the story of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Let's read, actually, this is very interesting, text number 5.
Our teacher, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, son of Elazar, a blessed man, set out on a journey across the sea along his household border, son-in-law, and all his possessions. He arrived at a city situated among the high mountains, mountains of large. You're very good. Okay. And he Lombard Alps in Germany. He intended to stay there until all those traveling with him gathered there. Suddenly, the Bishop of Basel rode down from Rome to that city. Together with him, the wicked Jewish apostate named recognized that teacher and formed bishops caused Count Meinhard of Bohemia, the Lord of the city, to arrest him on the 4th day of Thomas in the year 46 of the 6th millennium, 1260, and hand him over to King Rudolph.
Okay. So actually, it's a Jew who actually snitched on him, and ended up having him leading to him being arrested. Now, it says that there's mention of the fact that he was going by way of the sea, I believe it is, which is an indication that he was going towards Israel, which would make sense. We don't have absolute evidence, but that would make sense. So, eyewitness to the burning of the Talmud, he returns to Germany, becomes a leading halachic authority, fled to northern Italy, where they waited for the family arms, discovered to hand over to King Rudolph, and halted ransom payment because of the exorbitant fees. This is what we're going to get to now. King Rudolph decrees in 1286, when he's arrested, that all escaped Jews must be arrested and all of their property confiscated. And this still exists. We have it in German archives until today, this ruling from King Rudolph in 1286. So now what happens? He's being held, and King Rudolph is asking for an exorbitant ransom. Why an exorbitant ransom? Not only does he have a Jew, and the Jewish community actually redeems their fellow Jews, but he has the chief rabbi, right? They're going to pay a ton of money for him. So Rabbi Meir says to the community who wants to raise the money to redeem him, he says, if we pay an exorbitant price now, they will seize more and more captives, demanding ever higher ransoms for their freedom. And so he, as the rabbi of the leading rabbi, says, do not ransom me. I forbid you from ransoming me. Right? And so he stops the payment. And he has basis for this from the Talmud. Of course, the Talmud says a very important statement in text number 6. Let's read text 6.
For the sake of society at large, captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value. The reason for this is so that captives will not seize additional captives.
So he points to the Talmud, which is very explicit. And the Talmud says you cannot pay for a captive more than their value. Now you're going to be wondering, how is the actual value of a person measured? Right? All right, we're going to discuss that in a minute. Clearly, you have that question if you're living in 2025. Thank God. But this would not be a question if you lived 300 or 400 years ago. You know exactly how.
I don't even know if it's a question, but seeing the recent situation, how, two hostages were exchanged for 2,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then they're saying the reason that you're above, well, you just wanted 2,000 for two people. So, you know what I mean?
Well, that touches...
Say we could never negotiate with terrorists.
Yes.
Now it's like everything's upside down.
Yes. We're going to get to that at the end of the class. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is that there is a limit to this great mitzvah of redeeming captives, that you can't just redeem if what's being asked for ransom is way beyond their value, then the Talmud says you should not give it. Because we cannot save one person at the expense of many others in the future. Now, this is a very interesting ruling. I'm just going to share this for, I guess, my interest, and I think you'll find it interesting too. There is discussion in the Talmud about when you know one thing for sure and one thing as a possibility. Right? We call it bari v'shema. So when you know one thing for sure, and this is a maybe, but this is a definite, you always ride on the definite. Right? So one can argue that we know for sure that if we give $1 million for this guy, he'll be ransomed. Yes, we should only have to give 100,000, but they're asking for an exorbitant amount. But if we give that, he'll be ransomed. Whether other people will be taken hostage, we don't know. It's possible. We don't know. But yet the Talmud still tells us that in this case, the Talmud probably says that we do know. So it's not even a question. And therefore, you cannot give more because that's just going to lead to them taking more hostages. And so what do? We're forced to evaluate, right? What is this person's value? And the way you determine the value is historically this was defined by the price of people on the slave markets. People used to have a price tag because there were slave markets, and that's really how you evaluate someone. However you go through that calculation, but in those days that was done. So some people argued that Rabbi Meir was an exception. He was the chief rabbi. He was a major halachic authority. He has an importance which is much greater than everyone else. But guess what? He was the halachic authority, and he disagreed. Now, that's amazing, right? Because we know the natural bias a human being has to themselves. See, even with the greatest objectivity, when you're stuck a prisoner, right, you find justification to say you should be ransomed, and he still didn't do that, which, by the way, just shows you the greatness of who he was as a man, but how clear he was about this. He didn't have a question. Now, there's a great there is a great rabbi whose commentary on the Talmud we study as well. His name is we know him as the Maharshal. And he wrote a sefer called Yam Shel Shlomo, the Sea of Shlomo, because his name was Shlomo. And he commented, let me just see something here for 1 second. Yeah, so he commented on this in text number 7 very interestingly. Let's read text number 7.
I heard about Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was imprisoned in the fortress of Enshisheim for several years, and the ruler demanded a large sum from the communities for his release. The communities wished to ransom Rabbi Meir, but he refused, arguing that captives should not be redeemed for more than their worth. His reasoning must have been that if the communities would ransom him, it may incentivize other rulers to do the same and hold other prominent Torah scholars hostage for exorbitant ransoms. Eventually, the wealth of the entire Jewish people would not suffice to ransom them, and the Torah would be forgotten among the Jewish people. Here's a proof that he was right. After this case, the ruler stopped seizing sages and holding them for ransom.
So we see from that one can argue at least that actually this was the right decision to make, as much as it was a very painful one for Reb Meir. We call him Maharam Mirottenberg. Maharam, these names are acronyms. Morenu Harav Meir, our master, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. And he ends up sitting in prison for 7 years. And guess what? He dies in prison. He actually died in prison. So he was never redeemed. Now he did, when he was in prison, it wasn't, as they said in the video, he remained in prison for 7 years, but continued teaching Torah. He wasn't like locked up it was sort of a house prison. So he had students come and study with him. He wrote books of commentaries on Torah while in prison. Yeah. So, which itself is also amazing because he was able to maintain his focus. And I have to I'll throw in the story that some of you may know, but a story with the celebrated, we'll say modern day Chabad Chassid from Russia, Reb Mendel Futterfass, where he sat in prison in Soviet Union for 20 years. And, he has many stories that he shared from his experiences. And one of them was when everyone was sitting around all depressed. He was sitting with people who were doctors, lawyers, all these professionals, and now they were anti-government, whatever they were accused of, and here they are sitting in prison, right? So they were all depressed, but he seemed to be of his equilibrium was fine. He was fine. So they said, they all went around telling their stories who they used to be. And they turned to him and said, "What's with you? You seem to be so fine with all of this. You're not so depressed." He says, "I'll tell you who I was before I got into prison. I was a servant of God. And you know who I am today? A servant of God. My circumstances changed a little bit. I served, but I'm doing the exact same thing." It's very fascinating that here you have a great rabbi, but his identity wasn't that he was a world leader. It wasn't, he was a man who studied Torah, and of course he used it in the service. And now he was studying Torah, right? I'm not going to say that he wasn't. He writes very bitterly about his experience. Actually, we're going to see in this reading, he writes very bitterly about his experience because a Jew has to pray to God for help, right? So I'm sure he wasn't celebrating it, but at the same time, he didn't lose. Some people won't be able to focus. They won't be able to study Torah. They're out of their minds. They're just so upset. But he didn't. He wasn't like that. Let's read text number 8.
When I am released to safety, I will gladly ensure they receive a copy of my commentary on the sections of the Mishnah, Zerayim, and Taharot. During my imprisonment, I have not forgotten my Creator, and I have remained devoted to His Torah and to fear of heaven. From the souls obedient to your command, the impoverished, the individual forgotten of all goodness, the downtrodden doormat, once known as Meir, the son of Rabbi Baruch, of blessed memory.
Beautiful. So you see how he writes over here, the impoverished, the individual forgotten of all goodness, the downtrodden doormat. That's intense language, right? Once known as Rabbi Meir, the son of Rabbi Baruch, of blessed memory. But anyway, that was God decides, everyone's a journey. And that was his, but he carried it with great dignity, and he passes away in the year 1293. He passes away in the year 1293, and the king will not give his body to be buried. 14 years later, a wealthy Jew by the name of Alexander Wimpin decides that he is going to pay for the remains of the Maharami Rottenberg. And he does so, and he has him buried, and in the merit of the fact that he paid to get his remains and have him buried, Alexander Wimpin, who passes away only a few months afterwards, gets buried right next to him, which is a very great merit to get buried next to a great rabbi. This is a great rabbi, right? And not just because of this story, but also because of this story. And there's a story that they say that the night after he paid the ransom to redeem the Maharami Rottenberg, Mayor of Rothenburg, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg came to him in a dream and said, "I'm giving you one of two options: either to live a long life, where you, your children, your grandchildren will all will always be well off, or not to live a long life, but to share my portion in the world to come." What would you pick? So he said, in his dream, he said he wants to share a portion in the world to come, and that's why he passed away a few months later. And he came in a dream to someone, I'm forgetting right now who it was, and he told them that in fact he's sharing his portion in the world. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, he came to the local Rav, the local rabbi of the community, and told him that he merited to be together with Rabbi Meir in the world to come. That's a tradition that we have from a very valuable book called Seder Hadorah. It's a very reputable book. I'm just going to tell you also, interestingly, there was a great Chabad Chassid by the name of Rabbi Hillel Paritcher. He was a follower of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, and he was a very holy man. Even though he himself was not a Rebbe, they would say he was a half a Rebbe. He was a very, very holy man, and he once repeated this whole story. And he said Alexander's decision to take share a portion of the world to come with Rabbi Meir was fine, but that was because it was before the Hasidic movement was established. But now that the Hasidic movement was established, we should know that the proper choice would be not to share a portion of the world to come, even though it's very glorious, right? He says, why not? Because sharing a portion in the world to come does what for who? It does something for you. But staying in this world and doing more mitzvahs does something for the entire world. And so he was emphasizing the value of every single mitzvah, so that we give up, maybe something spiritually glorious for ourselves on behalf of the entire Jewish people, which is another form of great selflessness. It's not to in any way say anything negative, God forbid, about Alexander Wimpin. Clearly, he was a very selfless person, right? But it's just an interesting insight to think about in our day and age. And that's the story of a Rameir, and this is a guiding story when it comes to redeeming captives, about how to deal with that, and whether we should be spending exorbitant amounts of money or not, and how strict he was about this. Okay, and of course that leads directly into Israel, but we're going to discuss that soon. We have one more story that some of you this may be closer to home to than others, even though it was. I don't want to be too close to anybody. But this takes us back to an area in the world which is known today as Ukraine. But then back then it was not known as Ukraine. Then it was in the year 1648. It was known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is in Jewish history, it's known as Tach V'Tat. Tach V'Tat really refers to its numbers of years, and referring to the year of 1648, 1649. What's that? Khmelnytsky, yeah. The brutal Cossacks who brutally murdered thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews in the most brutal way. So at that time, to understand the backdrop of the history then, because this is a little bit different than our two previous stories. Our two previous stories were about captives of individuals. Now we're going to be talking about mass captivity. So what happened was, if you look at your map on page 166, figure 4.2, so you'll see the map that's in bold is the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And then below that, you have another place which you may have heard of called Crimea. Everything that's been in the news recently, right? So Crimea is controlled by the Muslims, and they have a group of wild, violent individuals called the Tatars. And in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the wild, ruthless group were the Cossacks. So it's two who really are opposed to each other, but equally violent. And they are both at the southern edge of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Cossacks are inside the Commonwealth, and the Tatars are outside the Commonwealth. Now, what was going on those days is, because of these wild, dangerous hoodlums, the Commonwealth had to deal with them to make sure that the Cossacks don't get out of hand. So they employed the Cossacks to protect their Commonwealth from the Tatars invading. They would also sometimes pay off the Tatars not to invade. So everyone's making some money, and you know what? When people make money, they're happy. Well, they're somewhat happy. But what happened is the Cossacks started getting upset that the Poles were not paying them enough. The Tatars got upset because the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth stopped paying them off. So what happened? This vicious, horrific individual by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky reaches out to the Tatars and says, let's create an alliance. Right? Let's create an alliance. The Christian, which is unusual, a Christian-Muslim alliance, because the Polish and the Lithuanians were Christian, and the Tatars were Muslim. But when it comes to violence, no problem. We're happy to align with each other. When it comes to hating Jews, killing Jews, we have a shir de hate, no problem whatsoever. However, in general, the Cossacks had a different agenda than the Tatars did. The Cossacks were pure, brutal people. The Tatars were brutal with an agenda, and their brutality with an agenda was, it doesn't make it any better, right? But their agenda was to make money. So the Cossacks wanted to murder people. The Tatars wanted to sell people. So what was their alliance? Their alliance was, that they would ransack villages, towns, cities. Anyone that was able-bodied, the Tatars would get, and anyone that wasn't, the Cossacks would murder. And that's exactly what they did. And this went on for about 6 years. Town after town of Jews brutally murdered. If you read the accounts of it, it's horrific to even hear the accounts. It's just unbelievable. People couldn't find loved ones. No one knew who lived, who died. And you had like whole towns just murdered, brutally murdered. Until in 1654, they made a treaty with Russia, and that sort of put an end to the trauma. So let's go over here. Sorry. So Cossacks and Tatars, warrior groups, formed military alliance to rebel against the Poles. Tatar waged pogroms against the Jews. Tatars took young, able-bodied people as captives, and this is going to lead us into our story about Rabbi Margolis and others taken as captives. And where were they taken to? They were taken to Istanbul. But before we get there, the Tatars sold about 10,000 slaves a year. Something tells me that was a very profitable business. And they grabbed all of the able-bodied Jews, everyone else they killed, and the account that we have, which we're going to start with in text number 10, is from a resident of Ludmir. And I mean, if you just think about it, I mean, it's just horrific. This is just a small account. We're going to get to the story in a minute. Let's read text number 10.
Who can recount all our troubles if all the seas were green and the leaves blue? They could not suffice to write of our afflictions. Who can recount how the Tatars in the region of Armenia and what all our problems used to be confident of the soul and all the actions of our ground. Now you have looked our ground to our ground. Give redemption for our ground. Our camps, the end of the God.
Very good. So that's a heartfelt cry. The story we're going to follow is, many are killed, many are taken captive, and we're going to follow the story of Rabbi Yaakov Kapel Margolis. It's a horrific story of a father taken captive with children, and they get separated. It's just unbelievable to fathom how people continued functioning with the emotional trauma. We talk about emotional trauma nowadays. These stories are emotional trauma, like beyond belief. And somehow they continue to move on. Let's read in text number 11.
The vicissitudes of time have carried me away, the evil decree that has befallen us in the land of Poland. We receive the results of heaven's decrees for us, those destined for the sword, to the sword, those destined for starvation, to starvation, and those destined for captivity, to captivity. The verse lists the fate in a progressive order of severity, for captivity includes all of the previously mentioned sufferings. I was among the exiles, taken captive with my son and daughter. We were led into exile in iron chains. My feet were bound in chains. They drove me and my children away from my family, from my father's house, and from my homeland to a foreign land. I have been banished from the inheritance of the holy ones. I said in my heart amidst my tears, who is with me? Who will be my tower of strength? Who in the heavens will spread his hands to take me, to draw me from the raging waters? Who do I have on foreign soil who will give me refuge and shelter? Who will stand by me and help me like a friend, to be like a brother to me?
So they're taken to a land where they actually don't even speak the language. Jews in the year 1648, what language did Jews in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth speak? Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish. They brought to Istanbul, Constantinople, right, and to Turkey. What language are they speaking there? Turkish, Arabic, I don't know, right? Not Yiddish. The Jews there don't know. They're Sephardic Jews. They don't know a word of Yiddish. Like you go today to Israel, right? You go speak to a whatever. I mean, but if you speak to a Jew who originates from Morocco or whatever, Egypt, right? It's like they don't know a word of Yiddish, right? They may know Arabic. Many of them do, right? I don't know a word of Arabic, right? So they come and they don't have a common language actually to speak, which goes to, to your point. And they're culturally very different too. I don't know if you've ever spent a few minutes in a real, what would the right word be? In a real Sephardic home, I mean a really cultural Sephardic home, right? On a holiday or a different time, things are, you don't feel at home in the sense of the culture. From the culture point of view, you don't feel at home, right? They're very warm people. You'll feel at home from that point of view. Yeah. The problem was the bigotry of the Ashkenazi Jews. I'm saying it as an Ashkenazi Jew, but that's okay. Yeah. But anyway, thank God we got, I think we got past that largely.
They would even consider it like intermarriage, but it was like not marrying an Ashkenazi.
Yeah. There's a lot to be spoken of about that, but we'll leave that. So that's a whole subject. But so it's not from the shining moments of the Ashkenazi Jews. I want to say that we, the Ashkenazi Jews, brought them in, made a lot of promises to them. I'm getting carried away here, but I'm just going to leave it. Yeah. But anyway, so they're redeemed by the Sephardic community, which is because that's the way we are. A Jew. We're there. It makes no difference. Culturally, I do understand what you're saying. I don't understand what you're saying, a Jew and we embrace, and especially in crisis, we're 100% there. And we have to practice being at 100% there even out of crisis. But we're very good out of crisis too. So what happens is that in Istanbul, which I believe was a well-off community, at least that's what for some reason I have that in my head. I don't know if that's true or not. But bottom line is they ran out of money to be able to continue to ransom all of these Jews that are being brought. They can't keep up with the number of captives. So what they do is they reach out to communities in Europe to say, we need your support, we need help over here. There were two rabbis in Venice, the Rabbis Yaakov and Yosef Aboab, who took on this responsibility to deal with this crisis, and they sent a letter to the wealthy Jews in Frankfurt, Germany, calling upon them to please, open their hearts and send an abundant amount of money to Turkey so that they can continue to redeem captives. So we see how important this mitzvah is to the Jewish people and how much we care for each other. Let's read the letter. Is a really beautiful letter, text number 13.
We address ourselves to the two commanders of Israel's armies, distinguished in mitzvot and good deeds, renowned and praised individuals unique in their excellence, the illustrious Rabbi Zanfil Lapaz and the illustrious Rabbi Ver Oppenheim. May they live with strength and peace. Our souls grieved as we heard cries for help coming from our brethren abducted from distant lands and the renowned city of Constantinople. The poor oppressed captives from Poland are grown in need as load after load arrives in Constantinople, strained and distraught. The Constantinople community is unable to continue paying for their ransom because their kindness and righteousness have already reached beyond the heavens. They report that they have indeed over 1,500 people expending a vast fortune of over 150,000 reals. What can they do now for the remaining survivors, the fresh arrivals who are impoverished and iron chains, suffering under the hands of harsh masters? For the sum of the donations from these places is insufficient for their redemption. Seeing that the esteemed individuals responsible for the redemption of captives have
turn to us, we feel it is our duty to compose this letter of entreaty to your honors, asking that you seize this great mitzvah. We ask you to strive with generous hearts and fear of God to arrange that the leaders of your holy community send money to the city of Constantinople as quickly as possible. You may send it whichever messenger you choose. Through our city, Venice, hasten the redemption of a multitude whose eyes look out desperately for your charity. The matter cannot stand delay. The faithful giver of reward, who sows righteousness and brings forth salvation, will repay your honors for your toil and effort in this mitzvah with double payment of the best. Blessings and success. May God raise you high and protect you with great strength and peace. Venice, the 4th of Tammuz, 5411, from your loyal friends who stand ready to serve you, Yaakov and Yosef Abba.
So this is the letter that they send, and I'm sure that they received some good money from this. If you want to understand the value here, so 100 real is the 26 days of wages that were given to a master carpenter in Venice. So it's basically a month's pay. Now think about it. In those days, they didn't have, a common person did not have a savings account, and they didn't have an investment account, and they didn't have an insurance policy, right? They didn't have anything. All they had was the cash in their pocket, and they lived usually day to day, week to week, right? So that means that I envision this. I envision that some parents said to their family, okay, we're going to eat half meals or quarter meals this month and put away everything we possibly can, and maybe over 2 months we can give enough money to ransom one person in Turkey. And that's probably how it happened. And that's what Jews do. And so they ended up redeeming we estimate 4,000 to 6,000 Jews in Turkey. And there was a French diplomat, right, in Turkey who commented, he was so amazed by the generosity of the Jewish people. Let's read text 14.
Amongst themselves, the Jews are extremely charitable. They take great care of the poor, adding to the price of meat 1 sol per pound. By the end of the year, this makes a large sum, which is used for feeding and supporting the poor, as well as ransoming Jewish slaves, whom the Turks and the Tartars take in addition to the Poles. As a result, there are no Jews in the Sultan's galleys, apart from those convicted of crimes.
Yeah. So it's really beautiful. In text 15, tells us about, brings out the point that I mentioned earlier about how even though there was such a diversity between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in our cultures, at the end of the day, we wear tefillin, we wear talis, our prayers are for the most part the same, but still culturally it's so different, and yet a Jew is a Jew, and that's something that was really beautiful that we saw. So we again see the very strong expression of this mitzvah of redeeming a captive. And here it is, Ashkenazi Yiddish-speaking Jews were rescued by Sephardic Jews who didn't even speak their language. When it came to Jews helping each other out in their time of need, no difference carried any weight. There we go, okay. So let's, the root of our connection, and what is the root of our connection? Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews is our Torah. We're all following the same Torah. We have different customs, different languages following the same Torah. Okay. Contemporary hostages. So we're going to bring this all a full circle here and discuss, and of course we're not going to be able to go into this in just 10 minutes fully. But by the way, if you do want to get more information about this, you can watch. I'm going to try and remember to include it in the email I send out. But who was here in the summer when I did the seminar, How Israel Wins? Was anyone here? How Israel Wins? Okay, a few of you were here. So I have a video of that on YouTube. It was a great seminar, and it will teach you a whole lot about what's going on in Israel now with a very healthy perspective. And we also discussed there the hostage negotiations and how that needs to be dealt with. Ideally, it's not 100% clear. There, in Jewish law, there's dispute. And this last year on Shavuos we discussed, there are different halachic authorities. There's the former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel has one opinion. There's a more of a consensus of a different opinion by many of the Ashkenazic rabbis. But it's still clearly not black and white, and it's very, very sensitive. But there is a point the Rebbe brings out, which I think is the most critical point, which we're going to get to in a minute. But the question is, how do we apply what we learned tonight to what's going on to the hostages at current day, unfortunately. The first thing we have to know is, it's a mitzvah. That's a starting point. There's a great mitzvah to redeem a hostage. That's number one, right? But the first thing is that we discussed that when we are going to ransom a hostage, we have to know their value, so we are not paying more than their value, right? So Vivi mentioned, how many terrorists are we going to give back for a single hostage? So firstly, what is the current price that other countries pay for a hostage? That would be a way. Today we don't have slave markets, thank God. So how do we evaluate? Well, one way to evaluate it would be to see what is accepted on the world platform for what do countries pay for redeeming a hostage, and that's how we can know. The reality is that most countries, at least civilized countries, do not negotiate. Now, there are stories, yes, behind the scenes that sometimes they do, but for the most part, the policies are that we don't negotiate, which means there is no price. Which then would say that anything that we pay for a hostage is overpaying. That's one point that has to be considered. This is not conclusive, and I'm not going to conclude anything absolutely, because I don't think it's absolutely conclusive. There is one point I will be very conclusive about in a minute, but that's not going to solve exactly what to do. Number two is, today, even though on one hand you can argue that there's no price that can be justified, on the other hand, we're in a very different situation than the previous stories of hostages. In those days, when there was a hostage, why did they take a hostage? They wanted to make money. But today, the hostages being taken is not about making money. It's literally a matter of life and death. And therefore, when we deal with something with life and death, we know in the Torah in general, we will do anything to save someone's life. So that would then counter that we should, it makes the price, when the Talmud says don't pay an exorbitant fee, that's because it's about money. But when it's about life, no, then you can give as much as you need to give. Now this is debated, by the way, in the Talmud. It's not simple at all, because what's the reason why the Talmud says that you shouldn't pay an exorbitant fee? It will lead to more hostage taking, right? Right? And what's going to happen if they know that we care, which is exactly what we see happening in front of us, right? More and more hostages. That's their game plan, is to always take more hostages. How many terrorists can we release terrorists in order to get a hostage back? Well, we all know that this is an enormous, enormous risk. I wouldn't even say it's a risk. I would say it's a definite, which is what many halakhic authorities say. And we all know October 7th was led by Sinwar. May his name be erased for eternity. And we know that he was a prisoner who was released in a hostage exchange, and he led the whole October 7th. So it's very clear that releasing terrorists for hostages is enormously, enormously problematic, and leads to many more lives. You're saving one life at the expense of so many others. The same idea. We're going to redeem one hostage, and then there are going to be 100 more hostages because we're paying all of this money. Another element which makes our situation very different today than it was in these past incidents is that there is an ongoing context of war. We're in the middle of a war, and in the middle of a war, we put soldiers in harm's way. Soldiers are being killed constantly because of the context of war. So individual life becomes secondary to the national need. And in that case, one can argue, I'm not saying this absolutely, one can argue that in such a case, the hostage, it's enormously, enormously tragic. And our hearts should be torn and filled with pain, but it's very questionable whether we should be making concessions in order to save one life when we're dealing with a national war. The critical point, which is something that I emphasized in the seminar, I think this is the most important point, and I emphasized in the seminar to emphasize it to myself more than to anyone else, because this is a real challenge. And that is what the Rebbe spoke about repeatedly, and that is our attitude towards our enemies. That the Rebbe repeated, the biggest problem is not, what halachic authorities say about how to deal with the hostages is debated by halachic authorities. The Rebbe, although he insinuated, he never said explicitly, but insinuated in a certain direction, but he was trying to get one main point across. Not so much what to do in this case, but how to make sure we're never in this position, which we are once again in. And we're once again in it, from the Rebbe's point of view, because we are not proud Jews. And when I say we're not proud Jews, we're surely not proud enough Jews. And that means that when we go to war, this is a law in the Torah, this the Rebbe was very clear about, that when an enemy rises up against the Jewish people, the Torah commands us that you must take them down ad ridita, until they are completely taken down. That means that they know that they lost, and they know that we will not tolerate them even picking up their gun. Which means that the moment an enemy picks up their gun, we kill them then. Not when they shoot their gun. Shooting their gun is way too late. You don't wait for Yemen to shoot another 5 ballistic missiles and then bomb them. Right? You bomb them so badly, right, that even they are going to think 10 times before, or whatever you have to do. I don't know what needs to be done. I'm not privy to inside information, but whatever that would be, to make sure that they know that they're going to think 10 times before they do something. Because if the moment we see them loading their rocket launcher, whatever it is, right, so to speak, that is the time that we need to act. And that shows pride when we initiate, like Israel did, although very hesitantly, but ultimately did do it in the 6-Day War. That is the only way Israel should fight a war, always preemptively, and we don't have to apologize. Just state the facts. Everyone knows the truth. We are always the ones who are under attack, and we don't need to apologize for anything. And that shows a pride. And the last thing the Rebbe spoke about very vehemently also is not to consider international opinion. It is easier said than done. That is very frightening, but it's only frightening until you do it. And once you do it, you see that people respect people who respect themselves. Always remember that. People respect people who respect themselves. I should have shown, because I just watched it last night, but Nachman may have heard some of it. There's the former president of Israel, what's his first name again? Rivlin. I'm forgetting his first name right now. Rivlin. He used to be a member of the Knesset, and when he was a member of Knesset, he hired a religious woman, young woman, to be his work in his office, and ended up becoming his chief of staff, and then ran his campaign to run for president. He ended up becoming president of Israel, which is a very honorable position. And when he became president, he asked her, "What position would you like in my office?" And she said, "I would love to continue being chief of staff." He said, "Fantastic, it's yours." So he had a woman who's a religious woman, has, I think, 12 children, right? A woman with 12 children, and is the chief of staff, flew all over the world, met the top world leaders, right? And one time they arranged a meeting for whatever purpose it was, where the president of Israel went to visit the Pope. And there's a major protocol that they gave them when you go to meet the Pope. And there's the whole thing, they lead you into this room, and from this room you go into that room, and then the door is going to open, and then from the left door, the Pope is going to walk in, and one person at a time walks over to him, shakes his hand, and he gives you a gift. So she told them that I cannot follow that protocol because I don't shake hands. So what you do is you shake his hand and you bow. You bow like that, and then he gives you a gift. So she said, I can't shake his hand because the only man I touch is my husband, and I can't bow because he's wearing a cross, and a Jew can't bow to a cross. So he's telling this to the, I don't know, I forgot the name of his, whatever. So they said, no problem, we're going to inform the Pope and everything is good. They get to Italy, they go into the car to go to the thing, and she asks the guy, she was very nervous about this, although she's had this also with actually, I'll tell you the second story too in a second. I hope it's okay if we go a couple of minutes over time. It's worth it. And so they get into the car to come to the Vatican, and she asks this gentleman, so did you inform the Pope? He says, oh my goodness, things were so hectic that I didn't inform him. She is sweating. What's she going to do? She's going to bring shame on the whole Israel. It's going to be the talk of town that, what she did, and she was inappropriate, right? Anyway, she doesn't know what to do. And they're going closer, they're going. And the door opens, the Pope walks in, Reuven Rivlin, the president, goes over, shakes his hand, bows, and he gives him a gift. She comes over, the Pope extends his hand, and she doesn't extend her hand. And the president starts to explain that she's a religious woman, a religious Jew, she doesn't shake hands with men. The Pope bowed to her, went like this to her, and gave her the gift. The Pope bowed to her. The previous Pope, Pope Francis, whatever his name was. Yeah. She was once with the President Rivlin in the White House, and normally what happens is the President of Israel goes into into a room with the United States President. It was then President Biden, and they talk together privately, and then after they talk privately for 15 minutes. The staff comes in. So this time was, I think, the last time, or I guess that she maybe would have the opportunity, or maybe it was the end of I forgot exactly when it was. So President Rivlin asked her, would you like to actually join me in the private meeting with President Biden? She said, I would love to. He says, fantastic. When we go in, I'm gonna invite you, and you just follow me. So he goes into the room with the president, and then she invites him in. He invites her in. She comes into the room, and what does the president do? He's a gentleman. He sticks out his hand. She doesn't stick out her hand. So the president says she's a religious woman. She has 12 children. So President Biden said, 12 children. If my mother knew that I was meeting with a woman who had 12 children, she would be so happy. He gets onto the floor on his knee and kneels to her. And I'm sharing these stories to say what? The good news I mentioned. He respected a religious woman, 12 children, right? And she's a chief of staff. Carry all of that, right? It goes back to our previous story about Jewish women, right? The bottom line is, the point is that when we realize who we are in this world, we are the people of God, and we represent God, and we stand up to that, then the world respects us. Now, there could be instances where they won't. That's also fine, right? We need to be who we are meant to be in this world, and ultimately, the world respects that. And that's what the Rebbe wanted more than anything else from Israel, from the Jewish people, and from each and every one of us, that we walk around being proud Jews. Thank you, everyone, for joining the course. Thank you. If you really start missing me, the next opportunity to catch me will be Sunday night, June 1st at midnight, which is technically Monday morning, June 2nd. We're going to have a midnight study for the holiday of Shavuos. I dare you to come. It's co-ed. We usually have about 30, 40 people here. It's really cool. And we're going to have a bunch of young rabbinic rabbis we're going to have a series of half-hour subjects, and then a fascinating talk by Brandon Swartz on a section of Maimonides. It's going to be a lot of fun. You don't have to stay for the whole thing. You can come for the first half hour, grab a cup of coffee, and then just to say you were here. I was here. Midnight. Okay. Have a good night, everyone.